My father grew up 1950s America. Orthodox Jewry, 1950s America. And America was more of a melting pot back in the 50s. You know, today everybody's into pride, cultural pride, ethnic pride, this pride. Everybody has, keeps nobody anglicizes their name. You can't even pronounce the name of your doctor anymore. I mean, it's like, the Polish guy who goes to the DMV and they ask him to read the first line. He says, "What do you mean read it? I know the guy," right? I mean, there's 14 consonants, no syllables. So, but in those days, people tried to fit in more. America was more of a melting pot. My father grew up as an Orthodox Jew in Chicago in the Midwest. And growing up, and then I remember this, my father did not wear a yarmulke when he went to work. He worked at Cornell Medical Center. I remember when he would, for lunch, he would close the door to his office. He would put on a yarmulke, make a blessing, eat his lunch. But when he saw his patients and in a professional capacity, especially in those days, there were very few doctors who did, and he did not wear a yarmulke. Okay. Now, my mother, may she be well, is a balas tshuva. A balas tshuva is a returnee. She did not grow up in an Orthodox traditional setting. And you might be familiar that when people are rejuvenating, J-E-W, when they're sort of on their way on the rebound, they have a certain zest, a certain energy. And in a certain context, my mother, and I don't know exactly how she phrased it, but she said something to the following. There was another physician. His name was Dr. Schuster. He was a physician from Bell Harbor, from Miami Beach area. He was a plastic surgeon. And he had a connection with the Rebbe. And my mother had heard that the Rebbe had told him he was a plastic surgeon. And the Rebbe said, "You make people's faces look good." Well, a man's face looks good when it has facial hair, when it has a beard. So why don't you consider growing a beard? And my mother wrote to the Rebbe, or talked to the Rebbe as follows, and says, "How come to this other Dr. Schuster, you encourage him to have a beard? And my husband, you don't encourage him even to wear a yarmulke when he's at work." I mean, that takes a little bit of guts, but that's the way she approached. That was what she asked the Rebbe. Okay. And the Rebbe responded as follows. The Rebbe said something to the effect, I'm not quoting verbatim. He said something to the effect of, I know your husband. Your husband, performing as a doctor, is fulfilling one of the mitzvahs in the Torah, Varapo Yurape. He's healing his patients. And I know your husband. If he's going to wear a yarmulke, it's going to interfere. He's going to feel self-conscious. And it's going to interfere with his ability to act as a physician, to be the best physician he can be for his patient. And that's the reason I don't push him to wear a yarmulke. Okay, that's one interaction. Fast forward. President Bush Sr., you might remember when he threw up in Japan. Anybody remember that? I don't know if you remember, he was hit. Anyway, but that wasn't part of that. President Bush Sr., actually his wife had contracted Crohn's disease. And shortly afterwards, he wasn't feeling well. And it was somewhat of an endocrine condition and a cardio condition. And they felt that my father could actually shed some light, and he was called to the White House. Actually, what wound up being is he was actually diagnosed with Crohn's disease. That's the essence of empathy, really, to contract the disease that your wife had. But that's what actually happened. But anyway, and he was called to the White House to consult on the case. Somehow, my father must have mentioned it too. We were personally very friendly with the Klein family and the Groner family, the secretaries of the Rebbe. And my father must have mentioned it. And my father gets a call at the house. And it's from one of the Rebbe's secretaries who says, the Rebbe has asked that when you go to the president, you should please wear a yarmulke. That's the story. Now, reflecting on this story, I'd like to ask you all a question. The Rebbe says that he's not pushing Dr. Resnick to wear a yarmulke because it can have an adverse effect on his patients. Now, unless the Rebbe didn't like Bush, and I say that sort of, why is it, shouldn't that concern be exacerbated exponentially so if your patient is the leader of the free world? So that's a question, and hold that for a moment. And I'd like to now move to a letter that the Rebbe penned about 6 months before he actually formally assumed the position, 6 months after his father-in-law passed away. It's a letter that I personally look at very often. I share it with many people, and to me, it's a source of inspiration. The letter goes like this. It's a 5-paragraph letter. Paragraph number 1 is the quandary, the question. The Rebbe sums up the question that he receives. It's from a man who is a shaykhid. He slaughters animals, and at that times, the stockyards are moving away from the city. You have to move out of the city, and he gets a position. He's not a wealthy man. He's a poor man. His father has just passed away. He now has a job opportunity to be a sheikhet somewhere outside the city. But what's the problem? There's not going to be a minyan there. He's not going to say Kaddish. They actually took out loans for the burial. He needs to support his family. And he writes to the Rebbe that if I take this job, we'll be able to repay the loans for the funeral. I'll be able to support my family, but I won't be able to say Kaddish. What should I do? That's paragraph number 1 of the letter. Okay? Paragraph number 2. The Rebbe extols the virtue of supporting one's family and how in Judaism we sometimes make leniencies and provide and allow for various leniencies in Jewish law necessary to support one's family, especially taking out loans and being able to repay loans spiritually. Having a loan for a funeral is not a good thing, and the Rebbe talks about it. Paragraph number 3 of the letter. You have brothers. Your brothers are going to be able to recite Kaddish. That's much better than getting a stranger to recite Kaddish, and that's very important. At least your brothers will be able to say Kaddish. Paragraph number 4 of the letter. If you're not going to have a minyan, make sure to give tzedakah for every davening. Make sure you should actually try leading the benching. You know, when you have a mezumin at the benching, if you can't lead the service, at least lead the benching and recite the proper chapters of Mishnah. Those are the first sum up of the first 4 chapters, first 4 paragraphs of the letter. If we were to stop the letter right here, each and every one would get the impression that the Rebbe is advising this man to take the job, listen. Then there's the last paragraph of the letter. And the last paragraph of the letter reads something like this. I write all of the above because I am unfamiliar with the state of your trust in God. But if you will have firm and steadfast and pure, simple faith in God, then you will trust that he can provide you with a job and livelihood in a space that has a minyan and the Rebbe's signature. The reason that letter is powerful for me is because there are really 2 modes of operation, and they're both real. Sometimes we need to compromise. Sometimes we need to take other considerations in mind, and that's true. But if we were to sum up on this 30th yahrzeit of the Rebbe, one of the things that the Rebbe dedicated his life was to push people to lift themselves up. There's another way of operating. I know that normally, Dr. Resnick, you might be self-conscious, but you know what right now? You're coming before the President of the United States of America. I'm asking you to be able to put on that yarmulke, proudly represent the Jewish people, and be the best doctor that you can be. I'm asking you if you can really manage to, you can believe that God's going to give you the job in a space where you're going to be able to say Kaddish for your father. The Rebbe dedicated his life, as Rabbi Solish said, to be able to looking at the individual, to each and every person, and nudging them, prodding them, encouraging them, sometimes gently and sometimes not so gently, to be able to add that one little thing that's going to allow them to blossom and to be great. And as I'm talking, if we can just put on the video, this is a small example. This is, as everyone knows, the dollars every Sunday. People would walk by the Rebbe for dollars. And this is a short 55-second clip of my mother and father with, I think I'm in the video, or in one of them, walking by on a Sunday afternoon in 1991. Everybody talks about the Rebbe transforming the world. And the Rebbe was thinking about big things. But you know what was big for the Rebbe? What was big for the Rebbe is that Mrs. Resnick should have nachas from her children. You know what was big for the Rebbe? That Dr. Resnick should be able to be successful in his medical research. The Rebbe looked at the macrocosm by focusing on each and every individual and saying, you can do a little bit more, pushing and nudging. You know that Hasidic adage of the man who decided, I'm going to change the world. And then pretty quickly, he came to the realization, I can't do it. Let me try changing my country. That didn't work either. So he said, I'll change my community. Didn't work. You know what? I'll change my block. I'll change my family. Then he said, you know what? The only person I can change is myself. But what happened? When he changed himself, all of a sudden, his family looked at him differently. His family started to change. People on the block said, wow, look at this family. And then the community changed. And then the entire state changed, and the entire country and the entire world. The Rebbe was focusing on the big, on the macrocosm. And he did so by showing each and every individual how they could do a little bit more. Senator Frank Lautenberg, he was senator of the state of New Jersey. He was, beforehand, he was the head of the UJA, the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, United Jewish Appeal. And there was a record, you can actually listen to the audio recording of his meeting with the Rebbe. He had a meeting at night. He comes in for an audience. He's there for a lengthy amount of time. I think it's about an hour. And they're talking about the grand issues, the great issues of Jewry in the United States, the macrocosm. And at the end of the meeting, Frank Lautenberg turns to the Rebbe and says, let's sum up what we've sort of said here today. And you could see he was sort of thinking about, okay, would you like us to try getting $250,000 for Chabad institutions? How much will it be? Give me the shopping list. I'll try doing it, Rebbe, and we'll see what happens. And the Rebbe turns to him and says, Mr. Lautenberg, if you wake up tomorrow in the morning and you see, the Rebbe says, in summation, if you wake up tomorrow morning and you look into the mirror and you see the same Mr. Lautenberg, then tonight I have accomplished absolutely nothing. That's the grand picture. This is the grand Mr. Lautenberg and United States Jewry. Become a better version of yourself. One of the powerful stories that I like to recount is in 1977, Prime Minister Menachem Begin came for an audience with the Rebbe. This was 4 years after the Yom Kippur War. Tension was building in Israel. He was slated to meet President Carter. There were going to be talks, and he wanted to meet the Rebbe to get the strength to be able to stand firm and to be able to stand firm for Israel's greatest interests. He has a long meeting, and again, they're talking about the issues of the world, about Israel. And finally, at the end, he says, Rebbe, is there something I can do for you? Thinking maybe the institutions of Israel and America, of Chabad in Israel, maybe we can raise some funds. What can we do? Listen to this. The Rebbe opens his drawer, pulls out a letter about a young woman in Paris who, the letter was, she was engaged to be married to someone not Jewish. The Rebbe told him, on your way back from Israel, you're stopping off in Paris, whatever the reason he was. Can you imagine if the Prime Minister of Israel finds a way to reach out to that woman and talk to her about this? Can you imagine what impact that'll have on her? And he did it, and evidently, she dropped it, and she's now married to a Jew. Prime Minister Reagan, this is the Prime Minister of Israel. What can I do for you, Rebbe? What can I do for you? There's a Jew. There's a Jew somewhere in Paris who needs your help. You know, everyone talks about the Rebbe focusing on the little, the individual. Do you know why? Because the Rebbe didn't see the little individual. He saw within that individual the great, the grand, the incredible, the unimaginable. This week in the Torah, we're going to read about a war that takes place between the Jewish people and a nation called Bashan. You might remember the big giant Og. Moshe, in this week's Torah portion, God says, don't be scared. You'll be able to beat him. Now that's rather strange. God doesn't tell Moshe, don't be scared when you go to Pharaoh. Pharaoh, the leader of the Egyptian empire. Moses is not scared. Moshe faces many, many, many great obstacles. He's not scared. But here, God has to tell him, don't be scared. Moshe is actually scared. He's scared to face Og in battle. Why? Why is he scared to face this giant? And our sages tell us so insightfully and so beautifully. They tell us as follows. You see, Moshe was scared because Og had done a good deed in his life. He was scared that that good deed would stand him in good stead. Whether it was him or whether it was his ancestor, it's not clear in the commentaries. But years earlier, 400 years earlier, there was a world war. Og was involved somehow. He was a refuge of the war. And he comes to tell Abraham, your nephew has been taken captive. You need to help him out. Og runs away, is this refuge, and he tells Abraham that I want to tell you, your nephew has been taken captive. Do you know why Og was doing that? He actually, in the back of his mind, was hoping that Abraham would go to try save his nephew. He would die, and Og would be able to marry his wife, Sarah. Og had ulterior motives, but nonetheless, he did that small one act. 400 years later, Moshe is scared of Og because that one deed might stand him in good stead, and maybe God will help him be victorious because of that one act. That's the way the Rebbe saw the individual, and that's the way the Rebbe saw the think big, the big picture. The big picture was made up of little individual, microcosmic acts, because they create a snowball effect. When you leave your comfort zone, when a person begins to leave their little comfort zone, what happens is that little putting on the yarmulke becomes a little bit more, becomes a little bit more, becomes a little bit more. And the Rebbe met you where you were. In Crown Heights, they have what are called pegishas. Pegishas are where young college students, young adults come together. They come together for a weekend. This would happen twice or three times a year. They would have youngsters come to Crown Heights. And there's a story that's told as follows. There was once a young lady who comes to Crown Heights for one of these weekends. She's coming into one of the houses in Crown Heights to participate. They welcome her. Shalom Aleichem, welcome. And she gives them like that look. She doesn't look happy to be there. They're trying to be nice to her. Hello, hello. She's really not very responsive. Comes time to light Shabbos candles. She goes through the motions. She lights the candles. She spends the weekend, not very talkative. She leaves at the end of the weekend. And the family who hosted her is wondering why she was even there. They get a letter from her a little while later. She says, I want to apologize for my behavior. I actually had absolutely no interest in being there for the weekend. My boyfriend was coming in from London. He told me he's going to be at the weekend, so I came to join him. But I want to tell you, I was moved. I actually hadn't spent the Shabbat in I don't know how long, or maybe I never spent the Shabbat. I want to tell you that when I lit the candles, it moved something within me, and thank you for the weekend. P.S. The raspberry sorbet was delicious. Can I have the recipe? Well, the family who hosted this girl figured that, we'd love to send this card into the Rebbe. Look, Rebbe, we are Chabad arranged this weekend in Crown Heights, and look, it moved to touch the girl to be able to feel warm and cozy and be more comfortable with her Judaism. Okay. They send the letter into the Rebbe, and the Rebbe writes on the top, Tach, Tach, thank you for the very good news, and then puts a big circle and an arrow to the P.S. Make sure she gets that recipe for the raspberry sorbet. That's important. That's called thinking big. That's called thinking big. It's recognizing that girl's raspberry sorbet is her association with Yiddishkeit, with Judaism, especially since it might be a non-dairy sorbet, which you can have after a meat meal. In the Rebbe's imagination, that is what we call thinking big. Each and every one of us, we're approaching tomorrow night. It's a very big day for the Jewish people. It's a very big deal for the Jewish world. It's 30 years, as Rabbi Soler said, it's Koach. It's the year of power. And each and every one of us, let us not underestimate our little thing that we're going to do. And we're going to say, you know what, Rebbe, I'm going to be inspired by your legacy. I'm going to be inspired by your life. And I'm actually going to make a big difference. I'm going to decide that I'm going to add 5 minutes of Torah study. I usually give X amount of charity. I'm going to up that by 1% this year. I'm going to come to shul 3 minutes earlier and make sure that I can get those extra paragraphs of davening in. Each and every one of us is on our journey, but that's called thinking big. And I'd like to conclude with the following anecdote. In Chabad, yeshiva students spend their summer months not just vacationing, but one of the oldest programs of Chabad is that yeshiva students go for the summer months to far-flung Jewish communities where they interact, find Jews. Many Chabad houses are actually started because they were visiting rabbinical students who come there for years and years. You develop lists and you meet areas that don't have a formal Jewish infrastructure, and thus you build Jewish life. I spent a summer in Tokyo, and people go throughout the entire world each summer. About 30 years ago, there was a pair of boys. You go in a pair, 2 boys. You pack up tuna fish, crackers, sardines, some grape juice, some wine, and you go off. They were going off to the western coast of Alaska. And they go from village to village, from town to town, finding Jews. In those days, there were things called phone books, if you remember those. You look up Cohns, Goldbergs, Katz's, you look up the phone book, and you try meeting Jews and making connections and establishing little Jewish mitzvahs along the way. They were going from town to town. This was in the month of August. The school year had already begun. They're going from town to town. They get to this one town. They're there. And they go through the usual motions. Go to the phone book, nothing. Go to the local gas station. Go to the local bar, the pub, nothing. But they figure, we're in this town. It can't be for naught. There's got to be a reason. There's got to be something we have to do here. So they decide to follow. They make their way to the principal of the schoolhouses. And they said, we have come to town. We are an ethnic species known as Hasids. I'm sure you love to expose your students to multicultural experiences. And it would be really, really wonderful if we could make a presentation of Hasidism. Wow, that's really, really interesting. We'd love our students to be able to see what you guys are all about. And so they come into the third grade where they make their little presentation. It doesn't sound as weird as the principal thought it would be. Talk about God, they talk about morality, they talk about justice, they talk about the Jewish people, and they end their presentation by saying, we are Jews. Does anyone here know a Jewish person? One girl, third grader. Third grade is a perfect age because they're old enough to understand, but young enough to not fully be able to know what you're supposed to say and not supposed to say. So the third grade girl says, yes, I do. She points to the teacher and she says, my mommy is Jewish. Caught by the admission of her own daughter, the boys say, we'd love to meet you. She says, after class. Okay. After class, the boys go over to her home. They spend time there. They sing some Jewish songs. They spend a wonderful amount of time with her. And they figured, this is why God had us come here, because we had to meet this woman. Now we know why we came to town. We're ready to move to the next town. They walk out of the visit, and she said, I just want to tell you my story. I grew up on the East Coast, grew up in a fairly Jewish and active Jewish life. I ran away from it all. I married out. And my daughter here, this is the first time she's seeing a Jewish person. As you're leaving, do me a favor. Tell her something that's going to stick and stay with her for the rest of her life. Now, you're a 20-year-old rabbinical student. You have to tell something to a third grade girl that's going to remain with her for the rest of your life. I have no idea what I would say, but I don't know if you've ever been in this situation. Chabad rabbis many times are. You don't know what to say, and you sort of think to yourself, God, if you got something to say, I got a mouth right now. So you can use me as a conduit, but you got to give me something. And God did give them something. They went to the car. They pulled out 2 candlesticks. They gave one to the mother and one to the daughter. And they said as follows. Every week when Shabbos begins, the first place on earth where the energy of Shabbos comes onto the earth is New Zealand and Australia. The serenity of Shabbos begins to envelop the world. Finally, Shabbos makes its way over to Israel. Bnei Brak is quiet. Jerusalem has calmed down. God is starting to enjoy himself a little bit. Shabbos continues across Europe, comes to New York. Once Brooklyn is quiet, now the earth is really starting to spend Shabbos. It makes its way across the country to Los Angeles, to California, to Alaska. The last place on earth where Shabbos comes is right here on the western coast of Alaska. You light these candles every Shabbos, and you'll be completing God's Shabbos. And with that, they leave. They return to the yeshiva in Morristown, New Jersey. A few weeks later, they get a postcard. They get a postcard from the mother. And she says, I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much for what you've done. My daughter, it changed our lives. P.S. I want to let you know, every Friday, as the sun sets over the hills in Alaska, as the sun begins to set, my daughter pulls on my shirt and she says, Mommy, God's waiting for us. He's waiting for us to complete the Shabbos. Come, let's light the candles. May each and every one of us light our little candle to do something to add more, because Shabbos is coming. The great day is coming. The sound of the shofar is here, where Mashiach will come, and the entire world will be enveloped by those little acts that together will create this massive flame, the coming of Mashiach. Thank you very much.